where do you see the next 5, maybe even the next 10 years for this country?
Political wrangling among the parties and economic wrangling among the business elites.
So the billionaires are preventing Pakistan from growing.
Talk to a local Seth. What's on his mind all the time? क्या वो उसको चेक के लिए कैश करने के लिए भेजा था, वो 2 घंटे हो गए वापस नहीं आया, उसे बोलो लंच ना कि they're micromanaging and day-to-day firefighting.
Where this energy crisis that Pakistan is in today came from.
Empires in those days did not have boundaries the way nation states in our time.
Right.
Authority sort of faded out into a grey area, and then somewhere on the other side of the grey area would begin an indeterminate location, the authority of somebody else.
All of the dollars are going out, but at the same time, I'm also printing rupees
to compensate for
these
dollars, right?
Well, no, for 2 things: for the circular debt on the energy side,
and to compensate
for the dollars.
Now it gets a bit complicated here because your money supply is collapsing on the one hand because of the drainage of dollar liquidity from the system.
A lot of senior people say textile has killed Pakistan, and part of the reason is because of what it did with gas and gas prices.
The IMF stopped all disbursements and said, first undo all these actions. And a huge crisis was created. Pakistan's relationship with its creditors was suddenly ruptured.
So basically Pakistan just benefited from these amazing gas fields.
Massive
and
availability of natural gas.
And
had bonanza we had not known at the time of independence.
Yeah.
That underneath this soil that we are getting is lie these riches. We did not know that.
So how come we're not billionaires like the Saudis if we were sitting on all of this gas? Things kind of retrenched, I would assume. And so there was probably a slowdown.
A big burst of investment in industry, in imports of machinery, in clearing of land for agricultural purposes, in the creation of a state apparatus.
So the military was the recipient of that power in most places, and therefore they were probably the most conscious of that.
Probably, you could say that.
Are the billionaires of Pakistan responsible for its energy crisis? Was your electricity bill in the months of June and July this year crippling? Is Pakistan on the verge of collapse because it cannot afford to pay its energy? All of these questions are being answered right now in this episode with top journalist on the economy who writes for one of the top papers, Dawn. His name is Khurram Husain. Watch this episode. It is going to answer all of the questions on whether we are on the brink of collapse or we're going to come out of this shining. Khurram Husain, how are you today?
Very well. Thanks for the invite.
So there's, it's funny that you're here. There was a thought that's been sitting in my head for a while, for the last couple of months, especially since I think it was in June, someone in my office sent me the electricity bill of our office space. And I saw the bill and I freaked out. I said, I'm not even here. This office is not being used. How can the bill be this high? Subsequently, I think it was a couple of days later, we got the bill for our home. We weren't home. We were on holiday. मैंने कहा यार इतना महंगा बिल कैसे आ गया? ये energy के साथ हो क्या रहा है? Why is there such a big crisis? And I started thinking in my head कि यार what is the problem with energy? Why is it expensive? Is it a mixed problem? Is it a problem of policy? Is it a problem of the way it is transmitted? कहाँ मसला है इसका? And then suddenly yesterday, you published an article in Dawn where you added another variable, which is the currency devaluation, that added another element to this. So before we jump into all of these variables, I wanted to take a quick step back and give me some context of where this energy crisis that Pakistan is in today came from. Let's say from 47, specific to energy.
From 47, where did it come from? Well, in 47, there wasn't much of a power system in Pakistan. We had very little power generation capacity at that time. There were maybe some power plants here in Karachi. There was one in, I think, Rawalpindi. There was one line. There was a Haidel power station in Swat. There was one transmission line that ran from Swat all the way down to Pindi. And much of the country was supplied from very small local grids. So there was a power generation, 1 megawatt power generation system on one of the canals in Okada, for instance, installed by Sir Gangaram. And Varsak Dam was built after that. So that electrified a little bit more of the country. It's not until the big projects that came in the wake of the Indus Water Treaty, when mega generation capacity began to be built in Pakistan.
And the Indus Water Treaty was 58.
So it was about 8-9 years in negotiation. So finally signed in 58, begun much earlier.
So for that 10-year period, let's say 47 to 58, 10, 11-year period, there was a lot of small scattered projects. And even Karachi at that time at the time of my partition, was not a big city.
No, hardly. It was about 250,000.
Exactly. So it wouldn't need that kind of power.
It didn't need the kind of power that it does now.
Right.
Nowhere near. And besides, our lifestyles in those days were not as energy intensive.
Right.
People had bulbs, they had a few fans in their houses, and that was it.
So no one really thought about power delivery, transmission, energy for the first 10, 11 years.
No, they did.
They did think about it.
Yes, they did. The first 5-year plan actually identifies the absence of power generation and the imperative of making power generation capacity as a very important imperative. They recognize that we need to industrialize. In order to industrialize, you need energy is a very important input. And not only power generation, but also a fuel distribution system, oil depots and everything. This was also the time when the first mega gas discovery was made in 1952 in Sui gas field, which then became operational in 1955. So the first supply of domestic gas began in that time period. So in any case, we built a gigantic, over the 1960s, a gigantic transmission network. And I think it's underappreciated in our time how much was actually done. Because if you just look at the amount of power generation capacity there was in this part of what was at that time the British Empire, the northwestern reaches of the British Empire, it was very, very scarce.
Would you say that this was the backwater of the empire? That's why it was not as well developed?
It was the frontier. It was the outer frontier. This was where the empire, empires in those days did not have boundaries the way nation states in our time.
Right.
So authority sort of faded out into a gray area, and then somewhere on the other side of the gray area would begin an indeterminate location, the authority of somebody else.
And that's what Pakistan was.
That's what Pakistan was, the territory we call Pakistan. The authority of the British Empire began to dilute further and further, the further west you went from the Indus River. And even as you approached the Indus River, you were approaching the wilds for a significant amount of the time. A large part of what we today call Punjab was not even populated at that time. And there are people alive today whose living memory they can tell you about how areas like southern Punjab were actually cleared of shrubbery and then water canals were built and how it came to be an irrigated zone.
So this was sort of the Wild West.
This was sort of the Wild West.
And in that Wild West, power had not played a role up until 47.
Except for the garrisons.
Except for the garrisons.
The garrisons, the port, wherever there was a need to station a population, whether a military population, a mercantile population or something.
So the military was the recipient of that power in most places, and therefore they were probably the most conscious of that because they had the most number of garrisons and camps and so on.
Probably, you could say that.
So now, 52, we had Sui, the discovery. 58, we had the Indus Water Treaty.
Yeah.
Now, suddenly with these two anchor events, 60s became a time when there was a
big burst of investment in industry, in imports of machinery, in clearing of land for agricultural purposes, in the creation of a state apparatus to manage all of this, an agrarian pricing regime. This was not a simple thing. The first another series of gas discoveries that led to the creation of Pakistan's first fertilizer plant that today we call Engro in Daharki. That discovery was made in the early 60s. The first laying down of a transmission grid and the first creation of distribution companies, and a telecommunication system over here. All of that was coming into being in that time. It was a very, very heady time. And that's why I think, people of your generation, when they talk pejoratively of the outlook that boomers have, because the generation that came of age in that time kind of like your generation came of age in the 2010s after the great financial crisis.
Correct.
Right. So the generation who came of age in that time, you people call them boomers, pejoratively, right? But their lives were shaped by this massive transformation that state and society was, and economy and everything was undergoing at that point in time.
So then this transformation happened, and if so much was happening at such scale, and Pakistan was on the map of the West, there was a lot of activity happening. People talk about a very progressive nation, a lot of industrialization. What happened? Why didn't the power apparatus get set up in such a way that it could have at least sustained to a certain level today?
You see, what happened is we built our power system in that time based on the best ideas available at that time, which called for the building of massive power generation plants, state-owned. It called for a massive investments in fuel supply chains for these power plants, also state-owned. It called for the creation of gigantic transmission lines and huge distribution companies,
also state-owned. And so I want to pause there. Why state-owned? Why not private-owned?
Because infrastructure development in that times, according to the thinking of that time, had to be state-owned. It was not something that a private investor would go into because it required very high levels of upfront investment, which paid itself off over a very long period of time and was dependent on only one customer, which was the state. So this was not suitable avenue for private investment. And then they recognize this. Okay, this is an area that the state is going to have to build in. The entry of private operators begins in the 90s.
So there was this gap in between then, that means, because there was the state-owned construction development, 60s, 70s were a bit of an unusual period because you had a nationalization period. So things kind of retrenched, I would assume. And so there was probably a slowdown.
The building of the power system continued through the 70s.
Because that was state-owned.
Because they were state-owned, so that was unaffected by the nationalizations.
And so you feel that progression that was taking place in the 60s continued through the 70s?
Continued through the 70s. So the first of the big mega projects of the Indus Water Treaty System comes in the early 60s, 64 or so, Mangla Dam. The second of them is Tarbela Dam. That comes like 76 or something like that. I forget the exact year, but it's like second half of the 70s.
Right.
So, and then the third was supposed to be Kalabagh Dam. And that was supposed to come in the mid-80s or thereabouts. So after Mangla was built, then they worked on Tarbela. Once that was commissioned, they were supposed to start work on Mangla. But then Mangla got entangled in the sort of a political wrangling between the provinces and fell by the wayside.
So I want to pause there as well. And I want to come back to the other thing that you mentioned. You mentioned that at that time in the 60s, big apparatus, big investment, the power was fueled by what source of energy at that point in time?
Natural gas from Sui or Hydel, right? The problem with Hydel was it's seasonal. You get Hydel electricity in abundance during the months of July and August, and then it peters off. And the dams were not being built for the purpose of power generation. They were being built for the purpose of water storage. So you can have year-round agriculture. And
Hydel, just to clarify for those listening, Hydel is basically creating electricity by the movement of water.
That's right.
Right?
Hydroelectric.
Hydroelectric. And there was no other source of energy to create power.
No, thermal and Hydel was the only.
Thermal and Hydel was the only one. No coal-powered plants.
Well, coal is thermal.
Okay, right. Sorry. Sorry, I was thinking gas and Hydel. Coal was the third one.
Coal was the third one. Most of the world went on coal in that same time period. Mind you, what happened in Pakistan was the common experience of many third world countries. Countries that were emerging from underneath the receding tide of colonialism. Okay, they came into being as independent nation states. They found that the colonizers did not really build for them an infrastructure designed to serve the needs of the people. They built an infrastructure designed to serve the needs of the colonial economy. So there were railroads, for instance, but there were no roads for the population to be able to travel from one city to another, or whatever there were inadequate for the purposes of the population. And likewise with power infrastructure and many other. So they had to get to work building infrastructure for themselves. Many of these countries went into coal because that was at that time the cheapest source of fuel. Pakistan went into gas because of Sui gas field.
So Pakistan would have gone into coal otherwise had it not been for Sui.
Yes. And not only Sui in the 50s, which was a mega find, But in 1980, that was supplanted by Badin, another mega find in Badin. In 1990, there was Qadirpur, another mega find in Upper Sindh. By 1998, there was Sawan. These are the four big ones. Alongside this, there were many others. Okay, there was Murray and there was Utch. And
so basically, Pakistan just benefited from these amazing gas fields,
massive
and
availability of natural gas.
And
this was a bonanza we had not known at the time of independence. That underneath this soil that we are getting is this lie these riches. We did not know that.
So how come we're not billionaires like the Saudis if we were sitting on all of this gas?
Well,
where did it go wrong? Because if you're saying up until the mid 80s.
Well, okay. I mean,
you gave it all to the consumer and they burnt it in their stoves. You didn't monetize it. I mean, come on. I think that's where it went wrong.
Okay, I mean, we built...
You put it in CNG inside cars and then, there was unaccounted for gas at 11%.
Let's say we squandered it.
We didn't realize what we had.
I don't think we appreciated it enough, and we squandered it and we gave it away dirt cheap. And as a result, we did manage to build an industrial system in this country. We built a manufacturing base where there was nothing but wasteland. That manufacturing base was in large measure powered by domestic gas. In large, I'm not saying entirely, right? By large, I mean there were by 2010, for example, something like 50% of our primary fuel needs were being provided by domestic gas. Today, that has fallen to 30% or something like that. So it's falling further and further and further.
So 50, okay, so now I want to pause here because I want to just kind of organize the thoughts here. So up until the 80s, we were doing fine with our big hydel projects. That slowed down. We discovered a whole bunch of gas all the way up until the 90s. We have an abundance of gas, right, that we can use and deploy. 60s onwards was the development of the infrastructure for our industrial economy. And that industrial economy saw that gas is super cheap. Let's build that industrial economy on the reliance of this super cheap gas.
Absolutely.
The pricing of which was determined by the government. And the government, because there was so much of it, decided to price it super cheap, I'm assuming.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. So we had an industry that had access to cheap energy. And they grew accustomed to it.
So now this cheap energy, and when we say industry, the majority of this industry that relied on gas is the big four, as I would call it, would be textiles, would be fertilizer, would be cement, and would be steel.
Steel, sugar
to a certain amount. So, and from the sound of what I've named, these are the big five cartels that run the country.
Yeah.
So how did this kind of play out? Because I mean, you had cheap gas, you're building out the industrial economy, these guys are building out infrastructure, and today it is these very five industries that seem to be controlling some of the outcomes we see.
Absolutely. I mean, this is how it's playing out, right? Since you're asking for the long...
Because I want to understand, because look, I don't think anyone in my age group or younger actually understands why are we here today? We just see a bill and we're like, what the hell is going on? Where did this come from?
We are here today, if I put it really simply for you, right? And Faizan, one thing I've learned in my almost 20 years of journalism, which basically involves the very close observation of, things happening on your beat. So my beat has been the economy. Close observation of Pakistan's economy and its economic management over the past 20 years has taught me one thing that's very important to understand. The answer, the reality in Pakistan is actually a lot simpler than people realize. And one of the reasons why a lot of analysts tend to miss what is happening in Pakistan's economy is because they overthink it. They're asking complex questions born from really complex models and complex economic thinking that is designed to understand and explain developments in an advanced industrial economy. But you're dealing with a very simple thing over here. What's happened in Pakistan is that we had a good run of things through the 60s. I know that some of our industry and business leaders will disagree, but through the 70s as well, fixed capital formation was continuing in Pakistan. It may have slowed down, and in 80s it continued again, right? So we were adding, for example, in southern Punjab is a massive power generation hub in Pakistan. So Capco is over there. Muzaffargarh Thermal Generation Station is over there. Guddu, which is not southern Punjab technically, but it's close enough. It's just across the border. Is over there, and then between them you've got a massive cluster of power generation centers over there, because that's where the gas fields were located. So the gas fields were then providing these plants with the fuel. These plants were turning that into electricity, and then the load centers were nearby. So Guddu was equidistant from Karachi, Lahore, and Quetta. And they turned out a really fortuitous discovery of gas right there. So they built a power plant over which was at the time one of the largest power plants in Pakistan, to provide equidistantly, to all three of these load centers. Likewise with Muzaffargarh, equidistant from Karachi and Lahore, can provide to both, and then Multan and everything else. So while all this was being built, we had a very large sort of an industrial system and a power generation system that was emerging in this country. But by the 1990s, this had run its course. By the late 1980s.
Why did it run its course that quickly?
It ran its course because governments, not only in Pakistan, but around the world, found that their fiscal base, the revenue generation base on which the government stood, was inadequate to meeting the kind of costs that infrastructure development was bringing with it. They could do it so long as there was foreign assistance being provided by the World Bank, by the United States, by the Ford Foundation. But those guys grew weary of it as well. After a while, after a few decades of building infrastructure in third world countries, they said, we can't keep doing this forever.
Because the ROI wasn't there.
The ROI wasn't there. Their own economies, their own contributors, the World Bank, where does it get its money from? It gets it from rich countries like the United States, started saying, we can't be providing our taxpayer money constantly to build infrastructure. Get private initiatives to do this.
And building infrastructure specifically in countries like ours.
Well, where there was a requirement.
Where there was a requirement.
Yeah. Countries like Japan or Germany could build their own infrastructure with their own resources. They didn't really need the World Bank. And besides, in countries like Germany, they had the Marshall Plan and whatnot. But it was the formerly colonized territories where infrastructure building was required. Some of those, like India, had much larger revenue bases and they could sustain their own infrastructure. They had huge coal deposits. They built more than half of India's power was being generated on coal at that time. We were lucky to find gas. The problem happened when the time came to transition away from this model.
I would want to add a layer to this, because if you're saying that it ran its course through to the 80s, we have to remember that was also a time that the Cold War was kind of ending with the Soviets, and this entire region was sort of going through that Islamization phase post, let's say, 78, 79, after the siege of Makkah and Iran and Afghanistan, the war that was happening. There was a lot of turmoil in the region. The country was also being used as a base by a superpower. Right. And so when that time ended or came to an end, it almost sounds like it was perfectly timed that, why do we need to do infrastructure projects and finance them? Our job is done. Let's go back.
You could say that, but it wasn't Pakistan specific.
Okay.
The withdrawal of agencies like the World Bank, which had done infrastructure financing in third world countries overwhelmingly from the 60s onwards, their withdrawal from infrastructure financing was worldwide.
But wouldn't you say that because the IMF, or let's say some of these funding bodies, are more pro-US, and the US was sort of in this global fight against Russia, when Russia did disintegrate in the 90s,
yes.
So now you don't need to invest and get people on your side. They're like, okay, it's broken up. Now let's just kind of chill.
Now get the private partner.
Exactly. Now get your private partner.
That may well be. That
and I'm just
something
this
that's
post facto maybe analysis. Maybe that was not the intention, but looking back at it,
the
timing seems kind of interesting, right? That suddenly into the 90s, now the American funded projects are all like, slowing down because there's no second superpower that we need to worry about. And China had not sort of accelerated at this point.
There was definitely a geopolitical angle. There were other angles too. Okay, there was the Latin American debt crisis. There was the dollar problem in the mid-80s. The Plaza Accords, the Louvre Accords. There were many things happening. And you're absolutely right. There was a much larger sort of a transformation taking place.
Late 80s, early 90s, right?
Mid-80s
onwards. Okay.
Right. And one element of that transformation was the withdrawal of lending bodies from infrastructure finance in third world countries. And they began to focus on building a policy framework that would, where private capital would be used to do infrastructure finance from there onwards.
So that sounds like the introduction of the IPPs.
Absolutely.
And that is the independent
Power policy.
Independent power policy.
Yes.
Okay, so walk me through that, because we hear IPPs all the time. Very simply put, no longer government funded, therefore we need to privately fund it. Out comes a policy.
Out comes a policy. So it began initially, before even the policy came out, with one project, which was probably, I think, the first privately funded power generation project in the world. And that was here in
the
Pakistan.
world?
I'm pretty sure.
That's a big...
Or at least in the third world. There may be examples in Europe, America, I don't know. But the first privately funded project was the one we call HUBCO over here.
And this was what year? I don't know.
This what
ballpark.
Began 88.
So it was in the
commissioned
90s,
like 93 or something. The work had begun even earlier. I think it had been, in terms of conception, it was there in 86 or something. Conversations had begun at that time.
So, and because it's interesting you say, so basically they'd retrenched the government funding, and the big institutions, the lending institutions said, we're not going to fund this stuff anymore. Private guys, you come in. Now, all these years, private has been staying outside. It doesn't make sense for us to do it. Serve one customer. Where's the numbers? I'm assuming the deal was really, really sweet. That
they had to make the deal sweet, right? Now, look, if you're a private investor, you're being asked to put down $1 billion. That's not a small amount of money for a private investor. For governments of that time, for the US government, for part of its aid budget, or for the World Bank, they could still, I mean, even for them, it was a lot of money. But for a private investor, that's
huge.
Huge.
Especially at that time.
Yeah. Now, if you're putting down that kind of money, and you're being told that you will receive your payback over the next 25 years.
And it's one customer.
There's one customer, and your project is in a country called Pakistan that is marked by,
everything.
A country that has coups, that has where governments are toppled and overthrown.
And this is 88. So within 20 years, they've seen multiple coups. They've seen a war.
Coup, they've seen assassination. They've seen,
Yes.
So they're like, hang on, if I'm putting $1 billion down and waiting 25 years, I need to know a couple of things. Number one, I set my plant down and I'm dependent on you guys for fuel supply, first of all, right? Because it's all state-owned, the fuel supply chain. Number one. Number two,
so I'm not buying the fuel.
No, you're buying the fuel, but I'm the one providing it, the state.
Correct. The state's providing
it. You don't have your own
yes, of course,
to bring that fuel to you, right?
Got it.
What if you set up the plant and tomorrow the state turns on and says, sorry, we don't have tankers to give you fuel, right? That we don't have availability of fuel for you. Number one. Number two, you say, okay, I have only one customer I can sell to, which is you. So you provide me the fuel, I make the electricity, and I sell the electricity back to you. What if you come to me tomorrow and say, I don't have the money to pay you for this electricity, right? And then number three, what if tomorrow, as soon as the plant is up and running, the government changes, new faces come in and they say, we don't even know who you are, bro. Right? The people who signed that deal with you, they're gone.
Right.
We're here. We want a new deal. We don't recognize this deal. As it turns out, all of these things happened.
And there was probably one more element to this. Let's say we do set up a plant and you don't use everything that I produce, and there's half my plant sitting idle, right? Yeah. Some sort of a capacity issue.
Now, you've taken loans, that $1 billion, you haven't taken that out of your pocket, right? You've put maybe 20% of that as equity. The rest is a loan.
And the mid-80s, if I recall, were a very high interest era. When the loan would have originally been, when the loan would have originated, the US was going through a high interest period.
Well, I mean, I don't recall, but given the size of the matter, it
still
doesn't
big
matter
numbers.
You're still talking big numbers. Right?
Yeah.
Now, you've taken a loan. You can't turn around and tell your bank, oh, sorry, they're not buying my electricity right now, so I can't pay you.
Yeah.
The installment for the loan. The bank will be like, you got to keep paying me, right?
That's right.
So they say, okay, look, what I'm building for you is the capacity to generate power. Whether you use it or not is up to you. That's what I'm giving you. And you pay me for that capacity.
This is what the private investor said.
That's what the private investor then said. He said, primarily what you are paying me for is the capacity.
And that's where the capacity payment term comes in.
That's where the capacity payment comes in, right? Because they said, what we are giving you, what our proposition is not the sale of electricity. Our proposition is the availability of capacity. We'll build that capacity. We'll station it here. It's there. The moment you make a phone call and you say, give me 800 megawatt hours of electricity, we'll fire it up and we'll give it to you. If you're going at 800, you call up and say, give me 900. I'll turn it up, the turbine, within minutes, you'll have 900 megawatts coming out. Okay? You will have that capacity.
So just for my understanding, the government is now paying for capacity, not for the electricity? Or is it paying for both?
Well, it's paying for both, but what the private investors demanded was that primarily what they pay for is the capacity.
So basically, if I'm thinking of it, my payment should be such that there is installed capacity of, let's say, X, and I produce nothing.
Yeah.
You still have to pay me a certain amount
Absolutely.
for that.
Because the capacity is there.
Because the capacity is there. Now, if I start producing, a little bit,
then 20% more.
You give me as much as I produce on top.
For the units that you take
for the units
from me,
that I produce.
Then you pay for that.
Makes sense.
Right? But
very logical.
It's very logical, actually. It's not, and given the fact that all of the apprehensions that private investors had coming and taking big long-term bets in a country like Pakistan with a single buyer and a single supplier of fuel.
And was it also hedged against the dollar?
It was, but in a slightly complicated arrangement.
So the capacity payments were not in dollars. They were in rupees.
The capacity payments were in rupees, but there was an insurance program run by the state bank that insured where the power producer could buy that insurance. It was optional. They could buy that insurance, pay the premium, and then the state bank would give them dollars at a fixed rupee exchange rate. Right, regardless of where the exchange rate.
So let's say the government's paying me 1,000 rupees, regardless of the exchange rate. I bought the insurance. The exchange rate goes from, let's say, 50 rupees to 100 rupees.
I can go to the state bank and
buy for 50.
Yeah, and redeem it at the original exchange.
And this is part of the deal into perpetuity.
This is part of the deal. I have not. I mean, the insurance scheme was available for as long as you pay for it, right?
Right.
If you want to avail it, go ahead and pay for it.
So I think there was some confusion that these payments were in dollars.
Yeah, but you see, they are. Right now we are talking about the first power policy. Mind you, there was one in 94, there was one in 2002, there was another in 2015.
Okay. And the rate of return, just for my basic understanding, for the investor, let's say if I was to completely simplify it, the rate of return on a project like this, in a market like this, at that time, was how much?
I think, I forget.
North of 20%?
No, not that much. I forget what it was, but it was still pretty high.
Double digit.
Easily double digit. I mean, we're talking like above 15, 20%.
So 15 to 20%. That's a pretty good rate of return.
Yeah, that's a pretty damn good rate of return. You see, the thing is...
So then, so makes sense. Completely logical, completely understandable why this happened. How did this start going south with the various power policies that came in?
Okay. It went south because this policy was meant to be the first step in a series of steps that you were supposed to take that basically unbundled this mega integrated grid that you had built from the 60s onwards into smaller grids, and eventually you were bringing the market, private players into power generation. You were now supposed to bring them into distribution, transmission, and everything else as well. Right. So what they did was they made the transition halfway and then they stopped. So what we landed up with, so we have private power generation, but state-run distribution. And
so why did they stop?
That becomes a bit complicated. They stopped for political reasons. They stopped because the power bureaucracy has a great deal of influence within the country. They stopped because they couldn't understand how to implement. You see, area electricity boards were supposed to be created. All the distribution companies were supposed to be transformed into what they called area electricity boards. Today we call them DISCOs, distribution companies.
Let me pause 1 second. So you're saying we've got the power generation that was privatized.
Yeah.
There's a power policy.
Yeah.
Now that generated power needs to be delivered and distributed to the end consumer.
Yeah.
So you've got these big transmission lines that are running throughout the country,
Yeah.
down to the local lines that are going and feeding your homes.
Yeah.
Those lines were owned by the government.
Yeah.
And the idea was to privatize in a sense.
Absolutely.
Privatize those as well.
Absolutely.
And if they had been privatized, they would have been far more efficient because they would have been run privately.
That's the thinking, at least, right?
Right.
And in addition to that, then the state was supposed to withdraw from the business of setting power prices. Right now, power tariffs are decided by one government entity called NEPRA, right? Or one state entity. It's not technically under the government. Legally, it's a regulatory entity, meaning it's autonomous. But nevertheless, it's a state entity. It decides the rate at which you will be compensated as a power producer and the rate at which you can sell your power. So you can have the rate at which the government will pick it up from you, the rate at which the government will then sell it on to the end consumer. NEPRA decides all that. This was supposed to end. Right.
And this was supposed to end around when?
Late 90s.
So by late 90s, let's go off a different
Early
trajectory.
2000s maybe.
Okay, so let's assume we went on that trajectory. The Pakistan today would have been a country with independent power, privatized generation and distribution, with prices set independently by market forces or these
Where
companies.
prices fluctuate even within the day.
Within the day. So my electricity bill would be variable on a monthly basis, entirely dependent on the national demand and supply.
It would be quite volatile that way. Sure.
And then dependent on, let's say, global fuel prices or whatever.
Sure.
Right?
The transformation would have been something along the lines of what we saw happen in telecommunications. Okay, in the same time period, we had an old system of telecommunications that relied on a landline system. There were lines connecting all the houses with a centralized hub and and it went all over the country. There were telephones. You picked up the telephone, you went tap, 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 and you dialed the number. You guys don't even remember that, right? Yeah. It's not part of your living memory. I do.
I do remember calling an operator and booking a call to the US.
Exactly.
I remember that.
That was the old system. And now from there, the way we moved, the way mobile communications came in, and now back then you had to chase the telecom operator to get a telephone connection for your house. Today, the telecom service provider chases you to get a connection with them.
Because we privatized that entire process.
And we gave it to various things. We moved the state out of it. The pricing is done by the operators themselves, depending on, whatever plan you are on.
And this could have happened for energy?
This is what was meant to happen on the energy side. So imagine if on the telecom side, if they moved halfway.
Yeah.
Imagine if they sort of privatized one portion of it and then stopped and said the rest will be controlled by the state.
Yeah.
Where would we be today? Do you think we would have 4G, 5G data connected?
I don't think we would have had a G.
You would still be using dial-up internet.
Yeah,
you would still be using dial-up internet. You know that modem voice now.
I remember.
That would be the world you would be in. That's what we've done in the power sector. That is the world we are living in.
So wait, where did that, tell me that period of time where this happened, where it didn't happen, that step didn't get taken, where, the rest of it was not.
Early 2000s.
So what was,
Musharraf.
Musharraf.
The coup, Musharraf tried.
So that was 9/11.
Musharraf tried and failed.
Was it because we were distracted supporting the US in sort of their skirmishes?
That gets a bit complicated and subjective. I will say it happened because the imperative to do so disappeared. The imperative to undertake this transformation was there up until 9/11. But once the money started to flow after 9/11, the imperative to take hard decisions, to confront vested interests, to bring about disruptive change, all that disappeared.
And the money started to flow because we started getting funding for supporting the US and all of that. And at that time, before that time, the money was not flowing, so we needed to. So we needed to stand around.
You needed to focus on your own economy and say, how do we bring down costs? How do we advance matters in such a way as to bring about efficiencies?
So we got hooked to our sugar daddy. And at that point in time, we're just like, we don't need to work anymore.
Absolutely. And no need for reforms. So, for example, I'll give you one example of how that worked. Okay, in the 2002 power policy, you see, in '98, when Nawaz Sharif's second government came, one of the first things they did was they looked at the private power policy, under which something like 16 private power producers had already come and established plants, and the billings that were coming from these private power producers was so large that pretty much something like 70-80% of WAPTA's total budget was going just to pay the private power producers. So WAPTA was the first to start making a hue and cry, saying, what the hell have you people done? Brought these private power producers into the picture. All our money is going as payments to them. There's nothing left here for us. And we are paying them even though we aren't taking the electricity.
Why weren't they taking the electricity?
Because, again, with the capacity charges, the thing is, in a sense and principle, in terms of its logic, it actually makes sense, right? But in order to have an effective power policy that has capacity charges in it, you need very good, sound, accurate power projections of demand in the future. Demand projections. You need to have a very clear idea, 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, what will the demand for my electricity be? Because if you overcommission, then you will be left with idle capacity 5 years down the road.
Correct.
That you can't use, but you still have to pay for it. But if you underproject, you'll be left with load shedding.
But that would require that entire system be privatized and operate as one system, right? Because if you're going to break the system up of distribution and generation, how do you understand?
Well, if you break the system up into private distribution, then you also do away with what's called the single buyer model. The single buyer model is where you are a power producer and you can only sell to one buyer, which is the government. Now I do away with that. I tell you, you go find your own customer.
So let's say, for example, me as an individual investor could have in the 2000s, had this policy happened, I could have set up some sort of power distribution company to serve this block 3 Clifton.
You could have bought power distribution rights for one block in Clifton. And that's
I would have been billing customers separately. It's just kind of like the internet, like Storm Fiber all of these other providers.
Exactly.
The fiber is there,
and
but you can actually lease the fiber and start selling your own
bandwidth, right? And trading it even. You could have a futures market in electricity. You could buy electricity a year down the road.
Which is exactly what's happening around the world.
They called it megawatts, right? Electricity that has not yet been generated. But the generator is telling you, okay, a year down the road, on 16th of June 2025, I will sell you 500 units of electricity at this rate. You want to buy? You can buy it. Maybe by then, the real price of electricity will be a lot higher. All of this was supposed to have, by now, come into the picture.
And all of this was dependent on gas, hydel, and coal.
Ultimately, yes. I mean, the fuel supply situation was, again, a decision that was now going to be left up to individual private producers, what fuel they want to go on.
So as an individual, I could have decided I don't want sui gas. I'm happy to switch mine over to solar or whatever, depending on, the
and then I'll sell from that.
So
if you've moved from single buyer to multi-buyer model, then you don't have capacity charges anymore.
So now the reason I bring this up is because something unusual also happened in the mid-2000s. Now that you've explained this part of it, in the mid-2000s, gas suddenly was being offered to private individuals. CNG stations cropped up and gas suddenly started appearing in cars, which is great for the climate. But it also created unaccounted for gas that was leaked through the gas transmission, right? And I'm just going to focus on gas for a second. Then there were these unusual gas projects that made very specific individuals extremely rich, right? That came from that era. Then we also saw a lot more cartelization, and these cartels of textile under the ambit of Aptima and then cement and all try to influence pricing so that they can get more gas to run their factories to make more money. Walk me through this, because it sounds like if there was one person setting the price and it's not market forces, now me as a industry, let's say I'm textile, I'm going to try to influence that guy to give me the price I need to make sure that I can make as many dollars as I can.
Absolutely.
So what happened there? Because it sounds like, I've heard a lot of senior people say textile has killed Pakistan. And part of the reason is because of what it did with gas and gas prices.
Yeah, look, the thing is, you can identify any one sector of the industry and say these guys have killed Pakistan. You can build a case around it. Okay? It becomes a subjective judgment whether you dislike textiles more than you dislike banks. Okay. And then it's your choice.
Right? But the concept was the same, right? The concept is that if there's one person setting the price, everyone's going to try to influence
that one person.
And is that what happened?
That's what happened. What happened is in 2002, in the power policy announced by the Musharraf regime, they tried to make the step. They tried to undertake an evolution in the whole privatization of power generation. And they brought in what's called competitive bidding. So they said,
and what are we bidding for?
For the rate at which you will sell power to the government if the government agrees to enter into a power purchase agreement with you.
But you've already set up the capacity, right? So the government should have a power purchase agreement with you.
Yeah, so now they're saying we are inviting bids for people to come invest in power plants in Pakistan, and we are asking you to come and tell us how much will you charge us per unit. To sell power to us, and the lowest bidder gets the contract. Okay, that's called competitive bidding, rather than the model that we had until then, which was upfront costs, where the regulator would decide, looking at each and every item of your cost, add a certain.
So like a PC1, that you bill it out. Okay, this is how much it's going to cost you. I'll reimburse.
Something like that.
Now they're saying that lowest cost bid.
Lowest cost bid gets the contract. Right?
Gets the contract
in 2002. That was meant to be a one step for introducing power, bringing about a market.
But still, this is focused on generation, not distribution.
Still focused on generation, but it was a very important step. But something went wrong.
What was that?
Nobody cast any bids.
Why is that?
Because right up before then, in 1998, the Nawaz Sharif government had accused the power generation companies that came under the IPP policy of 1994 of being crooks, criminals, thieves, and specifically pointed to the capacity charge and said, this is criminal. We are not going to pay. We are going to renegotiate these tariffs. He arrested the CEO and the CFOs of HUBCO and threw them in jail. He ordered the FIA to raid their headquarters. He froze their assets and their bank accounts over here, shut down their offices, and then suddenly discovered, after doing all this, that the World Bank happens to be an equity partner in HUBCO. The International Finance Corporation, which is an arm of the World Bank, happens to be an equity partner in HUBCO. The IMF stopped all disbursements and said, first, undo all these actions. And I mean, a huge crisis was created. Pakistan's relationship with its creditors was suddenly ruptured.
How can the Prime Minister not know this?
We're seeing the same controversy coming up again, right? Now, he had done this. It took something like 3 years for the actions of that.
No, but there's got to be something more below. I mean, as a journalist, you've got to know that there must have been something.
I remember that whole controversy. I remember the first articles that began to appear were sourced to unnamed officials, high officials in WAPTA, who are telling us that this is a criminal policy that has come in. It makes no sense. We are paying for power even though we are not buying any power from them. How can that be? Right? They couldn't understand capacity.
But they weren't they part of the decisions just a few years ago?
The PPP. Oh no, these people are not part of the decision. The policy had been brought in against the wishes of the power bureaucracy.
So now, let's add in another political layer to this. All of this has happened under, let's say, the General Zia era. PPP government came in, PMLN government came in, and each successive government was trying to just blame the other.
Blame the predecessor and reverse their policies.
So that's a layer that we were missing in this equation right now.
So it took the Musharraf government, and Shaukat Aziz actually sat down and then renegotiated the power tariffs completed the power tariff renegotiations with HUBCO and wrongdoing was found over there too. I'm not saying that all those guys were like squeaky clean or anything.
Right.
But nevertheless, if you think doing so would result in a significant reduction in power tariffs, it won't. But nevertheless, wherever there's wrongdoing, it should be corrected, right? So anyways, those negotiations were completed, and right after them, they came up with the 2002 power policies, invited bids. And naturally, all bidders looked at each other, looked at the government and said, we just saw what you did to the last round of people who came and invested. Are you nuts? You think we're going to come in and invest on a competitive term?
Right.
No way. You give us a guaranteed upfront tariff, number one. Number two, you give us guaranteed protections that same thing will not happen again.
Makes sense. That's a fair ask.
So now they had to, in that power policy, further write down into law, okay, we will never ask for renegotiations on these things ever again and blah, 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 right? They had to strengthen the regime further for the private investors. And in 2004, they had to do away with the competitive bidding via an SRO. So sometime late 2004, an SRO was issued saying, okay, never mind competitive bids. Here's the upfront tariff. And then a dozen or so projects came in. And by 2006, they had power purchase agreements. By 2008-09, they began to come online. And by 2021, they were being accused of making excess profits. And you might recall there was a Muhammad Ali report that suddenly started investing. It was all these guys that were investigated in that. And then they were asked to renegotiate the tariffs all over again and whatnot.
So basically a situation was created where people didn't want to invest because of what they saw over a 10-year period.
Yeah.
Sorry. Let me recap this. Basically, you had to get independent private power producers because government and global financing didn't want to support it. You had to sweeten the deal to get them on board. You got them on board. Successive governments said, oh, that was a wrong deal, and then kind of threw them in jail and said, this is all black and wrong and ghalat and whatever. And then suddenly
campaigns run against them.
And then 5 years later, you're like, hey, wait, can we get some more investors? And the investors are like, why would we ever do this? No. Here, let me sweeten the deal. Only after the deal gets sweetened, the investors come in and do what needs to be done. And now we're going back and saying, you know what, you guys are getting way too much more money. And
every time you do this,
isn't there like a scribe for the government that can like pull up notes and minutes of the meeting and just be like, hey guys, hold on a second. Remember 2002, we did this? Like,
every time you repeat this cycle, the next time you have to invite bids, they ask for even more protection.
So the IPPs are not that bad then?
I'm not saying they're good guys. I'm not saying, but what I'm saying is that they are not the root cause of the problem.
So they're businessmen. Look, they're going to look for opportunity, right?
They're going to look for opportunity. They're going to make sure that they protect themselves from this kind of policy volatility.
And they're going to try to get the best possible price. So why hate them? And especially after you've created an environment where none of them were willing to even come in initially, right? So they are obviously going to go all out trying to protect themselves.
Yep. So basically what happened then is after the 90s, we landed up with a power system that was sort of a bizarre hybrid of private and public, investments. And what we had was, in fact, I would go so far as to say the worst of both worlds. We had the costs of the private sector, right, with the IPPs and all that.
Cost, so that you're saying that's a good thing because of the efficiencies, or
no, the costs meaning the private sector power that the electricity you're buying from the private sector generators is more expensive than the one you buy, because government can tell its own generation company come. But so we had the costs of the private sector, but we had the inefficiencies of the public sector combined with the two.
So inefficient and expensive.
And this is the era of the rise of the circular debt, right? The circular debt begins to appear first on the books of HUBCO and then on the other books of other things, but sometime around 2006. By about 2007, it's rising up to a point where these companies start to go public saying, okay, look, this is creating liquidity problems.
So just for simplicity's sake, circular debt means... Can you just give me a quick synopsis of what that means?
The state's inability to pay the costs of power procurement and transmission and distribution.
So the state can't buy the power because they don't have the money.
It doesn't have the liquidity. It doesn't have the money with which to actually buy power. So
it can't buy the power.
It takes the power and gives you an IOU against it.
Got it.
Say, abhi aap de dein, aage de denge.
So now I get the IOU. I go back to the gas company and I give it that IOU. Because I can't pay it for the gas that has created the power.
You give them the IOU in return.
Then the government
tells the gas company, take the IOU, okay?
I'll eventually pay. And then the gas company does its work, generates some expenses and says, I can't pay you. And generates another IOU to its next person behind in the backstream. And this IOU passing around continues.
It lands up on the books of PSO, for example, as payables or receivables and then they start managing the accumulation of the debt rather than trying to figure out how to solve it.
So why not print some more money and solve the problem?
That's exactly what they started doing. Right?
What year was this?
The money printing had actually begun in earnest right after about 2003. But it's in about 2007 that it shoots up with the approach of the 2008 elections and with the maintenance of power sector, of energy sector, to pay for energy sector circular debt problems and things like that. Shoots up to the point where by about November or so 2008, printed money as a proportion of total money supply, the amount of money you've printed and injected into the system, is almost reaching, if I remember correctly, the percentage might be wrong. I think I have the data. It's somewhere just above 20%. But I can tell you this much, it had reached the same levels that it was at in the late 90s following the nuclear detonations and the sanctions. Okay, when sanctions were placed on Pakistan after the nuclear detonations. 98. Pakistan basically survived on printed money.
I remember it had down to 500 million in reserves of something ridiculously low.
Oh yeah, imminent default and all that. So it had reached that level again, right? They had brought that down to zero, from there to zero in 2003. By not only halting the printing of money, but buying back all that they had printed and pumped into the economy.
So pause right there. The money supply, the equation that you said that 20% of printed money.
The 20% of the total money supply consists of money that has been printed and injected artificially into the system.
Okay. And what is the global average for a country like ours?
Oh, that'd be hard to say. I think it would vary depending on your competitiveness and many things.
What would be a good range?
Generally, the rule is that your overall money supply growth should not... it gets a bit complicated there. Generally, the rule they follow is it should not exceed your GDP growth rate, but then they also say, well, it should not. So the percentage increase of overall money supply should not be faster than the economy's ability to put out goods and services.
So let's assume our GDP growth rate is 4%, 3 to 4%.
Then that's about what it should be. Right?
And we were at 20%.
No. The overall money supply growth rate would have been much lower than that.
Right.
Because mind you, now it gets a bit complicated here because your money supply is collapsing on the one hand because of the drainage of dollar liquidity from the system. As your trade deficit has blown all bounds, dollars are flowing out of the country. There's capital flight happening and your foreign exchange reserves are at peak.
Because you've got to pay for all of the products that you're buying.
Yeah. So if you look at your foreign exchange reserves from 2004 onwards, you'll see them plummeting, and it accelerates.
So you're
the rate
basically,
at which it plummets.
because you are an import-based economy, you have to pay for all of the things that you're buying.
Yeah.
All of the dollars are going out. But at the same time, I'm also printing rupees
to compensate for
these
dollars, right?
Well, no, for two things: for the circular debt on the energy side,
and to compensate
for the dollars. Now, suddenly
dollars
that should have a significant impact on my exchange rate.
It does. A very significant impact, because suddenly your economy now consists of a bloated supply of rupees and a diminishing supply of dollars.
This is 2007, 7.
By 2006.
And then comes the global
financial crisis on top of that. It comes and hits you, right? So
the PPP government walked into the worst.
The worst of the worst. A terrorist explosion that happened in the aftermath of the Lal Masjid episode.
The Lal Masjid, the Marriott bombing of, I think, 2008 or 9 or something. I mean,
Marriott bombing happened after, right? But the Lal Masjid event was a trigger.
Yes.
For the wave of terrorist bombings, number one. Number two, they walked into the aftermath of the lawyers' movement and have to deal with...
The May 12th. 12 May jisko kehte hain, I think.
No, 12 May was one event on the timeline of the lawyers' movement, right?
Okay.
The lawyers' movement ki jo main signature event hai, that actually was the imposition of emergency in November. The attempt to forcibly remove the Chief Justice.
Got it.
Those events.
So you had that, you had the terrorism, you had this global recession, you had a bloated...
you had a circular debt on the fuel as well as the power side. Tab to petrol mein bhi thi, because the Musharraf government had not adjusted petrol prices before going out. Then they had the Mumbai incident to deal with, right, at the height of all this. By about August 2008, Pakistan's financial system was seizing up. It was shutting down.
And yet that government finished its term somehow.
Not only finished its term, it saw through one of the most important and far-reaching constitutional amendments.
The 18th Amendment.
The 18th Amendment.
So why do they say that
was...
And
put such a powerful consensus behind that 18th Amendment that to this day they can't figure out how to reverse it.
So how... Okay, that's a whole different conversation, is why people say that government was a flawed government if it was dealing with all of this and yet managed to finish its term, deliver the 18th Amendment. And I believe that it also did a lot of work on CPEC and the pipeline. No. It didn't do work on CPEC.
Not CPEC, but there was
a TAPI pipeline.
No, not TAPI. There was a pipeline built, I think, from Karachi to Muzaffargarh. A white oil pipeline.
Right.
But that had begun before. But that's not really... That's a project.
That's not a big achievement.
It's not it's an achievement, but I mean, it's not the signature achievement.
So now, at this time, with all of these variables getting layered in, we already had an energy problem.
Yeah.
In the form of circular debt, in the form of this really flawed half private, half government system, in the form of these really expensive deals we've cut with private investors to get them incentivized to come in. Where do we go from here? And by the way, there was also, if I recall, there was a shortage of capacity overall where the requirement was far greater than what was available. And so we started seeing a period of load shedding in the early 2010s, if I recall correctly.
Okay. The load shedding began in 2007. It picked up throughout 2008. And what happened in that time period, and there's a direct line that comes from there down to our time. Because what happened in that time period was there was a small sort of generation availability problem. Okay? But the bigger problem was affordability. They had idle plants sitting there, but that they could not afford to run. That was the bigger problem. Why
was it affordability? Was it
because they had to go on an IMF program. The IMF program halted the money printing. They could no longer monetize the circular debt. They had to bring it down. And the only other place from where to meet the expenses of this bizarrely hybrid power system was either from the government exchequer, the government pays in subsidies, with again the IMF program said nothing doing, or it was from the consumers by hiking up the rates of electricity, which the democratic government of that time said, we're not doing. right? So you had this the situation of a seizing up of the power system, so to speak.
But weren't they giving out? So while there was, and just from my understanding, while there was a load shedding taking place, both on the industrial and the consumer side, wasn't there still a system of tariffs in place for some of these cartels?
Yeah,
at that time?
There was.
Isn't that kind of counterintuitive?
Yeah, it is. It is.
So then how did the cartels get away with tariffs?
With tariffs, you mean, or with subsidies?
Oh, sorry, with subsidies. That's what I meant. Subsidies.
By putting the blame on each other, right?
So I want to clarify that again. So you had these industries that were being given subsidies at a time when there was a shortage of available power. There was load shedding taking place on industrial and retail consumers. How does the math make sense? How can you give a subsidy?
The math makes no sense.
So then were they using influence?
And mind you, this was also the time period when the gas fields that powered the whole system
were depleting.
Had already entered their phase of decline. So SWI was accounted for less than, which at one point in time accounted for the majority of the gas in your system. By now it was like less than 18%. Sawan gas field had peaked in 2007 and it was now beginning to decline. Qadirpur was still operating.
Was no one tracking gas?
Badin was pretty much finished.
No one was tracking how much gas is coming out of the field, how much is left. It's like a...
They were just having a hard time getting through to the decision makers at the top. So there were people... The fact that Pakistan will start to run out of gas by the year 2010 was known in 1992. It's there in the 6th 5-year plan. The projections are there and it is written in there by 2010, U2. So you've got to start transitioning into something other than that. You've got time between now and then to bring about this transition. We didn't use that time to bring about the transition. We used this time to wrangle and muddle and blame and accuse and renegotiate the tariffs and all those things. And then to advance a reform and then to roll it back, then to advance it again and to roll it back again. But we didn't do it really to find in earnest a way out of our dependence on domestic gas.
And during all of this time, was it right for private enterprise, private industry to be able to get subsidies, to be able to generate profits and make money effectively?
But it's very, very hard.
So then why didn't the government clamp down on those subsidies to those guys?
It's very hard to take away subsidies from the rich for any government anywhere.
Why is it hard?
Because the rich are connected. And they have...
so they pay their way through.
They pay their way through and they have influence in your government... everywhere, it is very, very, very hard for the...
So you're saying basically the rich industries in that time period when we're almost out of gas, when we're sitting with circular debt, when retail consumers are suffering load shedding, the rich are basically paying their way through to get richer and continue receiving the gas that they need.
Well, they're wrangling among each other and saying, yaar, throw that guy overboard.
And this is basically 4 sectors. This is textile, cement, steel, and fertilizer.
No, this was fertilizer, textile, CNG, and power generation.
So CNG got crushed.
CNG got crushed
because they were mostly individuals.
They were loosely organized.
They were loosely organized, and the one that benefited is textile because they had Aptima, which was a machine.
Which is a machine. So textile, and they had a good voice. Power generation. They have their own ways of getting through this because mostly a lot of their costs are, and they said no problem. You want to cut gas to us? Go ahead. We'll just switch to oil, right? Oil costs more, but mind you, fuel cost is a pass-through item.
And then what about fertilizer? How do they manage to?
Fertilizer is the holy cow of Pakistan's economy.
So how did they do their arm twisting?
They just said fertilizer was very clear. Asad Umar was the chairman or the president of Engro at that time. And he was like, you want to do it? Go for it. Even to this day, Engro is on the forefront saying, bring in market reforms. But then let us set market prices of fertilizer.
Which will make it unaffordable.
Farmers will still pay the market prices.
But it'll make it unaffordable because it'll pass down in the form of the end.
It will lead to food inflation.
Food inflation, yes.
There will be a spike in food inflation. The fertilizer manufacturer will be untouched by it. The farmer will not be that as
the end consumer gets completely
hit. The urban consumer will be impacted.
Which, by the way, has already happened as of now. The urban consumer is hit. So they might
by
as well
food
have,
inflation, absolutely.
so they might as well have taken that hit at that point in time.
But bringing about food security in Pakistan was a decades-long process.
Right.
Along with all this, the biggest priority that the second 5-year plan in the early days that I was telling you, the biggest priority it had set in the 60s was attaining food self-sufficiency by 1970.
And I think in one of your podcasts, you mentioned that they had finally attained food securities by the 90s.
No, even in the 70s. The first year when Pakistan did not import any wheat, its major staple product, is 1970. Up until then, about half, if not more than half, was imported.
But weren't we recently importing wheat?
Well, we have now gone back to importing wheat, but back then it's about 11% of our requirement, right, as per latest data. Back then, we were importing more than 50-60% of our wheat requirement. वो खत्म करना था, ठीक है? The first year we didn't was 1970. Then I think from 76 onwards, it becomes a consistent trend. We are producing enough wheat to meet our own requirements.
So coming back,
digress a little bit.
So coming back to this 2010-11 period where we had a shortage.
Yeah.
Now take me from there, and the CNG got crushed. The cartels managed to survive, which they always do around the world. CNG got crushed, which was weird because of CNG, you had unaccounted for gas increase, which I was talking about, from like 7 to 11%, which is basically the leakage of gas through the pipeline network or whatever. And the pipeline network also got old and just in shambles, whatever. What happens from there till now? Because one thing did improve. Load shedding, I recall, has improved or gone down. It wasn't as bad as it was in that period.
Right.
So how did load shedding improve? And how are we here today where it's absolutely unaffordable?
Here's what happened, right? In 2008, when the PPP government comes in, there's load shedding everywhere. Only part of the reason for why that was the case was due to generation capacity shortages. A large part of it was due to financial reasons. They couldn't afford to run the power plants that they had on their system. They couldn't afford to buy the electricity that they had in their system. But everywhere in that time, the TV talk shows were lit with one phrase, and everybody universally pointed to the Musharraf government and said it's his fault because during his time, not a single megawatt of electricity was installed.
I remember that.
You remember that, right?
Yes.
This was a huge
everything.
Mantra.
In fact, time. Nawaz Sharif then picked up on that, I think, and said, "Ki maine itni capacity installed kar di hai."
They said, "Theek hai." If the issue, the whole issue got framed as a shortage of generation capacity, when in reality that was actually not the entire problem. That was a part of the problem, right? But it got framed as that. So when Nawaz Sharif comes in, he rallies, he campaigned on ending the power crisis. In 2013, that was his campaign. He said, vote for me, I will end load shedding.
Correct. I remember that.
And he went and procured more generation capacity than the country could possibly handle. Right. And he said,
even though that was not the real problem.
Even though that wasn't the exact, it was part of the problem.
But the other part of this problem was this weird system, hybrid
weird system that you left with, no reforms happening everywhere, and the inefficiencies and everything. That was another part of the problem.
And the circular debt.
Which was then fueling the circular debt. So, but he overcompensated. And now we've got the other way around. अब मसला वहीं का वहीं है. मसले की शक्ल बदल गई है. ठीक है, 2008 में हम कह रहे थे कि यार 1 मेगावाट नहीं लगा, तो इसकी वजह से आज लोड शेडिंग हो रही है. आज हम कह रहे हैं ज्यादा मेगावाट लगा दिए, हमारा बिल फट गया है यहाँ पे.
We have to pay capacity payments.
Because now we have to pay the capacity payments for all those
capacity that we don't use.
So by 2016-17, they were bragging about the amount of megawatts of generation capacity that they have installed and presenting that as a success story.
Correct.
Now we're finding out that came with a bill. It came with a price tag.
And now it's time to pay that bill.
Now it's time to pay that bill. And the projections that they had done for the demand and whatnot, their people are going on the airwaves and saying things like, oh, but we projected 6% growth rate for the next 10 years. Yeah. And the demand based on that, we didn't anticipate that there's going to be this sudden boom, down to growth rate coming down to 2%. And
isn't there in all of this, isn't there a division of the government that does strategy and thinking and sort of long-term projections? There is.
In fact, there's more than one. There's more than one. The problem is nobody listens to them. and even when they do, they listen and then it sort of gets lost in the noise of it all, right? And with some dismay, I do note that I've seen successive governments, not only this one or the previous one, but successive ones, respond overwhelmingly to the noise being made on TV talk shows, and
Absolutely.
not enough to...
It's like a CEO running his company based on the stock price.
Exactly. Or even worse, based on the water cooler gossip. Right?
Oh,
Making their decisions based on the
absolutely
water
right. That's
cooler
an
gossip.
even better example.
So, but and that's what happened in the 08, 09, 010 period. One of the consequences of that, of framing the issue as a shortage of generation capacity, is that now we are saddled with more generation capacity than we can swallow.
And we have to pay for it.
And we have to pay for it. ठीक है? The fact that the capacity charges are there, बाकी सारी चीजें ठीक है ना कि over invoicing की होगी, करो उनको audit. I don't care, right? कि वो अपनी heat rates में misquote कर रहे हैं, किया होगा, करो audit. I don't care. But in principle, the fact that capacity charge should be there makes sense. But you don't like capacity charges, do away with the single buyer model.
But look, in addition to that, so you've got a capacity issue. You've installed more capacity. To fuel the generation of power, you need an input, right? You need a fuel. Gas has finished.
Gas is finished. Yeah.
You've not installed any additional hydel on a major level because you're still stuck with that third dam which never got completed, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Hydel, Kalabagh didn't get completed, but
you had
others came.
You got some others that came up online. Solar comes into the mix and becomes a thing over the last, let's say, 15, 20 years. Wind becomes a thing in the last 15, 20 years. And then there was this whole conversation and chatter around setting up liquefied natural gas, LNG, and RLNG being bought from different sort of Qatar and wherever, shipped over in ships, very expensive, plugged into the system to generate power. How did all of that also impact our energy price today? Because and I remember TV talk shows talking about us not doing long-term contracts, buying this kind of gas from Qatar, which impacts our pricing, right? So the question then arises, if it's not a capacity problem, is fueling that capacity an issue? Are we fueling it the right way? And do we have the right energy mix to generate power right now?
Okay, there's I think 3 or 4 questions in there. Let me get to the root of it, okay?
Because I've understood how I get how we've ended up here.
Yeah.
But I think this part of it we kind of omitted, and I want to make sure that we capture that.
Okay. What's happened, the key thing that happens from 2010 onwards is that we've got this flawed hybrid public-private system that's neither private nor public. And we're trying to make a go of things with it. We've got this really noisy public discourse that one day laments loudly the absence of enough power generation capacity, and next day laments loudly the presence of too much. We've got a policy environment in which one day they want to invite investors and give them all kinds of sweet terms, and then next day they turn around and say, hey, what are you doing with all these sweet terms? This is wrong. We want to renegotiate. We've got all this happening. Underneath all this, a key tectonic movement is taking place, and that is the depletion of our gas reserves, domestic gas supply. In 2010, 50% of our primary fuel requirements. Primary fuel basically means the fuel that is used to provide energy for your economy in different ways. It's the fuel that will power your furnaces and your boilers. It's the fuel that will power your power plants, your generators, move your cars, everything. So 50% of our primary fuel needs are being met by domestic gas. Today, that's come down to somewhere around 30%, 35%. But if it turns out to be 36, please don't
So let's say it's come from 50 to 30, ballpark.
And it's falling rapidly.
And one thing to note is that was very cheap gas.
That was gas that we could tell ourselves whatever price we want to sell it at, because the infrastructure to distribute and to extract it has already been depreciated, right?
Right.
That's paid itself off.
So it's pretty much free in a sense.
Now we can sell it at whatever price we want.
Right.
We chose to sell it at $1, for example, as feedstock gas to fertilizer plants.
Right.
Where we are importing it at 18, 19, 20, sometimes 28, $30.
We sold it at $1?
Even now, fertilizer plants get feedstock gas at $1.
$1? And they're importing...
No, I'm just $1.29. Don't kill me for
sorry.
it.
So under 2... And we're importing it for...
18, 20, it varies because that's market pricing. But if you just compare the cost of wellhead gas pricing in Pakistan, how much does the gas in Qadirpur gas field get sold to, or Murray gas field get sold to Engro, for example, or to Murray fertilizer, whatever, Fatma fertilizer, and naam le raha hun sabke, but beyond fertilizer, power generation as well.
It's very simple. You just find out who's got planes in the airport, and you figure out where the cartels lie.
But we're buying gas, LNG at what if you were to at 18, 19, 20, but at its peak we've bought it for 28, 29, 30 or
$29 at its peak. Wow,
I mean,
for that range. I'm not being specific, but
that's the point.
30x, like a 28 to 30x.
Faizan, that's the point I was making.
So why are we complaining about where we are? If we did it to ourselves.
Look at the distance we now have to travel. Now, as domestic gas runs out, energy prices in Pakistan will have to, there is no other way, will have to reflect market realities. And how much of a gap there is between where we are and where the market reality is, you can find out by looking at the wellhead price of domestic gas and the landed cost of LNG. That gap tells you where we are going.
So the wellhead price of domestic gas, let's say, is around the $2-ish range. Is that fair? Around...
Well, it depends.
I'm ballparking.
No, they sell it at different rates to different categories of consumer. So fertilizer gets the cheapest of the gas. The domestic consumers get a different pricing and whatnot. Nevertheless, it is way below LNG. And right now they have a very...
Why don't they just price it the same price as LNG and just call it quits?
Well, wait till and see what happens to the economy the moment you price domestic gas at market prices.
Because you're not going to get it cheaper than LNG, right? Let's say there's zero domestic gas. Your next best alternative
is LNG.
Yeah. So that means LNG is your price.
Yeah, exactly. From here onwards, that's
okay. So if that is your price, the best thing you should do is get as close to it as possible, or at least get halfway there.
Start moving in that direction.
So are we taking those steps on an annual basis?
We are trying, okay, and it's not easy. The PTI government, for example, brought in a regime that they call WACOG, weighted average cost of gas. So they said, well, we'll take a blended. We'll take a weighted average, taken off all the various wellhead prices there are in Pakistan and of LNG, and determine a weighted average cost.
That makes sense.
That makes sense. So WACOG reform is an old one that has
been implemented?
No. They passed the law, they did everything, but they never notified it.
Who stops it from being implemented?
Again, the vested interests that are going to be impacted.
The four cartels.
Which is your billionaires. The vested interests that are going to be negatively impacted are very,
so the billionaires are preventing Pakistan from growing.
They would put it differently. They would say, we are trying to keep Pakistan growing. And if you undertake these steps, that's what they would say, right? I think, in my opinion, they're just trying to hold on to their billions.
So now, we're stuck in a dogfight. What's the way out?
The way out is, I think...
because the billionaires will not relent, right? And they can buy their way through anything.
No, they will relent.
Why would they relent?
Because they are rational people. They're not idiots.
You believe?
Yeah, I do believe. They are rational people.
They weren't rational up until this point.
I know them at a personal level.
No, that's why I'm asking you.
No, what they are doing is very rational.
Because why weren't they rational up until this point? Because if they were part of the problem, look, think about it. We're here today because they have been part of the problem. Realistically, let's be realistic about it. If you're buying RLNG at $18 and you're getting $1, locally, come on, I mean, realistically speaking.
They should see it coming.
So if one of the things that I learned at grad school, in business school, is and I learned this when I worked in investment banking and I covered the industrial sector. We used to look at companies that operated super efficiently, driven by metrics. You could look at their financial statements and you could actually tell that this is what that company would look like if I walk into it. And they would typically look like that, right? If it's a clean set of financial statements, the metrics are all great. You walk in, it is a super efficient business.
Sure.
I have not seen a super efficient business in Pakistan because everyone is run on subsidies.
Yeah.
Everyone is running on subsidies. And when you're running on subsidies, you're not going to be efficient because it's free money.
Yeah.
So if it is free money and I'm used to free money for the last 30 years with my entire life, how will I ever be able to reform and become that super highly, sort of charged business? I can't. Totally, I don't know how to do it.
Totally get your point.
But so as a billionaire, if I've never made my money being especially efficient, and if subsidy is what made me my billions, I'm dead.
If subsidies is what made you your billions, it is rational to try and do everything you can to hold on to those subsidies.
Correct.
Right? what needs to happen, and these are not these are not necessarily troublemakers. These are not people who will like secretly egg on the TLP to go and throw a dharna.
No.
वो नहीं करेंगे.
These are straight up business people.
These are straight up business people. They will come
In fact, I would even go back and say, you know what? I would say these business people are a lot like the Americans in the 1800s setting out railroads at the time.
Yeah, sure. The sort of robber baron.
The robber barons,
era of,
the Rockefellers, the early JP Morgan era, where you know what, there was a lot of influence.
Yeah.
There was a lot of uncertainty. And there were people actually going out and doing stuff, and they got a lot of subsidy from the state and they got a lot of benefit from the state. But they got their act together over the next 50, 70 odd years.
Mm-hmm.
But for that period of time, there was a big difference between the billionaires and the non-billionaires.
But you see, then there comes a point where they have no choice but to acknowledge that the reality has changed. One thing about business owners is that they are keenly in touch with reality. They're not ideologically given. And that point it's pretty close now.
It's dawning.
It's dawning on them. This whole capacity charges thing that APMA has manufactured is it's fine. I mean, look, I've got no love for the IPPs. You want to go renegotiate their tariffs, go ahead and do it. There's no skin off my back. I'm just telling you, it's not going to make any material impact on that July bill that took your breath away when you received it at home. You want to find out what will make an impact in that bill?
That's what I want to know.
Look up your July bill from 2019. Look at the number of units consumed, make sure you're in the same slab, more or less. If you're not, then find your June bill or something. Just find a summertime bill from 2019 and a summertime bill from now. That's more or less in the same slab. And look at your per unit cost. Just look at the amount payable divided by the number of units. In 2019, you'll get a figure somewhere between 17 to 23 rupees per unit back then, depending on the slab that you were in.
Okay.
Do it now for the latest bill that you received. You will get a figure somewhere around 70 rupees, 70.
And this is a period of 5 years. 5 years, we're looking at a multiple of roughly
more than triple.
Yeah, you're looking at about a 4x multiple.
More than triple. And mind you, the full impact of the July 12th notification has not yet been factored into the bill. Your last bill contained at least half of those days were pre-July 12th. Okay, so those were calculated at the old tariff. Your next bill is going to be the real killer because the full 30 days are going to be on the new tariff.
It's going to be worse?
It's going to be worse. Okay? Now,
oh wow!
Now do an exercise.
Just learn to live in the dark now.
Now or get off the grid.
Get off the grid, yes.
Because it's faltering. But if your rupee bill has gone from anywhere from tripling to quadrupling, somewhere in that order of magnitude. Now convert that same bill into dollars at prevailing exchange rate.
I was doing that math right now. Literally, I was doing that math.
So you will find your
it's actually cheaper.
In dollar terms, no, it's not cheaper.
Because your dollar was about
30, 40, 50%.
No, because the dollar at let's say 2019 was ballparkish, about 120-ish.
Thereabouts.
Right? Today it's about, let's say, 300-ish, simple math.
Just do the exercise after this program and tweet your findings. Okay? And you will find that in rupee terms, your bill has increased massively, whereas in dollar terms, it hasn't increased by that much.
Correct. It hasn't increased that. You're right.
Because a 40% increase in dollar terms, let's say, means what? Something like 8% a year. Fine, that's...
No, so I did the math very simply. I said, okay, if 2019 the rupee was at about 120, today it's about 280, the bill has 4x'd. The unit cost has 4x'd. Then at a $120, if I do a 4x, I'm at 480. But the dollar is at 280. So it's actually not the same proportionate increase. In fact, in dollar terms, I'm actually better off.
What's killing you is the devaluation. What's killing you is not really, let me put this is somewhat counterintuitive. It's going to be a bit puzzling, but I mean it in all earnestness. The price of electricity has not gone up. It's the value of the rupee that you are earning that has plummeted. And that's why it's appearing to you as if electricity has become expensive. What has actually happened is that your real income, adjusted for the inflation rate, has fallen. That is the real problem here. And as a result, your rising power tariffs are to some extent owe themselves to all the dysfunctions of the power system, but they are also a part of the larger inflationary environment that you find yourself in. ठीक है, the same reason, like just like look up how much it costs to buy one box of milk. I
Yeah.
assume you run on back in 2019
Yep.
versus now in rupee and dollar terms. Again, just do that. You'll find the same thing happening there.
Cost of fuel.
Cost of fuel. ठीक है, do it in rupee and dollar
It's
terms.
about 90 or 100 at that time.
You'll find the same thing there. So that's what's really going on, and the reason why our power prices are now, you see, in the past when our power was largely being produced from domestic gas, the fact that it's our own gas shielded power prices somewhat from exchange rate fluctuations.
Correct.
Right? The dollar could go wherever it wanted. The price of gas would stay.
Now it's not the case.
Now it gets adjusted. Fuel prices get adjusted up and down. And the more and more you are relying on imported machinery and depreciating imported machinery in order to, through your bills, number one. Number two, on imported fuels, the more your power bills are going to reflect overall the strength of your overall macroeconomic.
So what you're basically saying is you're making the argument that the billionaires are not only the bad guys. There's all these other variables in play as well.
Let me say, my poor billionaire friends, I feel sorry for them sometimes.
Well, look, you have to pick on someone, right?
All those
and everyone loves to pick on the billionaires.
But my favorite is when they ask me, Khurram, where should we invest? What should we do? I'm like, you're all billioned up and nowhere to go. I mean, look at you. You know, I've traveled to, I went to Australia once at the invitation of the Australian government. They took us all around and it was a wonderful trip. And met all kinds of like government ministers, regulatory and business elites. The business people over there, some of whom were doing very well indeed, were very concerned about the fact that they were doing very well. And he said, my problem now is that I'm making a lot of money. I said, why is that a problem? And he said, well, all my competitors see that I'm making a lot of money. Pretty soon, all of them are going to move into this industry. And when they move into this industry, my profits are going to go down. So I need to worry about where do I go next. That's what was on the guy's mind all the time. Talk to a local Syed. What's on his mind all the time? यार वो उसको चेक के लिए कैश करने के लिए भेजा था, वो 2 घंटे हो गए वापस नहीं आया, उससे बोलो लंच ना किया. You know, they're micromanaging and day-to-day firefighting. And then number 2, लगे हुए के like टोले बना के ना secretary power के पास जा रहे हैं, टोले बना के secretary finance के पास जाने की, ये फलाना tax आपने लगा दिया, ये फलाना. Take one of our local billionaires and ask them 2 questions. Okay. Number 1, ask them, what is the next generation of business opportunities that you can discern on the horizon? Look 10 years out, where do you see the next generation of business? Directionally बताते हैं आप मुझे. कहाँ आपको टेक में नजर आ रही हैं, आपको एग्रीकल्चर में नजर आ रही हैं, आपको मिनरल्स में नजर आ रही हैं, कहाँ नजर आ रही हैं आपको? ठीक है. Number 2, question number 2, what can the government do to help your industry? Ask them these 2 questions and look at the quality of the responses that you get. In response to question number 2, you will get a long, detailed, very focused, very clear list. The government should do this. In response to the first question, you'll be like...
Scratching their heads.
Yeah.
Because they've not thought about it.
They haven't thought about it. Or you'll get answers that are all over the place. So
in this environment, and you're so right, I was literally visualizing that conversation with one of these guys, and I could see that long list. In this environment, this is a 2-pronged question. What do the next 5 years look like? Right? That's the first. Which will then lead to the second is where, based on that response, where should someone who has recently graduated, has the ability to exit, what kind of decisions should that individual take?
That individual should go where opportunity is. Okay. Now, to some people, that sounds like I'm saying you should be opportunistic. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying where you find career opportunities. You should go where they are. You should not be emotional or jazbati in your decision making. You should not say, मैं अपना मुल्क, मुल्क अपनी जगह संभाल लेगा अपने आप को. आप अपना सोचें. Young people के लिए. Number 1. Number 2, don't let money be the guide for your decision making. Don't say that I will go in this job or this career because more money is to be made there. No. Go where your passion takes you. Okay? Make sure you love what you do and do what you love. And so long as you follow your heart, I don't mean to sound like a romantic, okay, but it worked for me. It worked spectacularly for me. It's probably the only thing that has worked in my life. Okay, I followed my heart. I followed my passion. And
well, you have a bunch of billionaire friends, and you're like the number one guy that everyone goes to when it comes to topics on the economy and research and analysis and all of this.
In addition to that, I've got a badass for a wife. So, things worked out. Things worked out pretty well. And the only reason they did that is because I followed my passions. And I did what I loved, and I love what I do. And I let my heart make my decisions for me. And it, guided me well.
And so now that you're doing this and you're the guy in this topic, right? Like I've been wanting to have this conversation with you for such a long time. Where do you see the next 5, maybe even the next 10 years for this country? Like, walk me through so there's two ways to look at it. Walk me through what you think should happen. So there's the ideal scenario, and then walk me through what you think will happen, which is based on past performance. This is how I think it'll play out.
A lot depends on how the politics of the moment work themselves out.
So let's identify the should first, because the should is politics free, because
the should is a very large. It's a very large should, right?
Because it's a bit of an idealistic response. I get it, but I would like to see what that ideal should is.
Yeah, I mean, look, nothing changes until this country adapts to its new energy environment, number one. Number two, it adapts to or does something about documenting the economy.
So in that should, documenting the economy would you say is number one?
Part and parcel of growing the tax base and all that, right?
So the retail, tax the retail, tax the agricultural sector, tax the real estate.
Get them into the net, get the incomes documented, improve the visibility of the state in terms of what's happening within the economy. That's not only for tax purposes.
So that's
also for purposes of devising better policy.
So better policy, better taxation system and collection, more documentation of the economy, which will upset some people. We're talking about idealistic outcomes right now. What else? Specific steps.
Improving competitiveness of the enterprises that we have, because right now they're not competitive.
Because they're subsidy driven. Yeah, they're all subsidy based.
They're based on and they are premised on cheap inputs that the state can no longer afford to provide.
Exactly.
Them. So
then that means build capacity of our enterprise, which we, by the way, locally don't have that capacity. We now have to get it from outside. Okay. What else would there be?
There would need to be ultimately very large investment in the people of the country, in their well-being.
So education and healthcare?
Education, healthcare.
But that
becomes a very large agenda at that point.
And that payoff is too long. It's 20 years. We don't have 20 years. We have 5.
But it's a very sturdy payoff by the time it comes. But you're saying 5 to 10 years.
Yeah.
I mean,
you'll have to start investing.
You'll have to start in that. And that's, I think, up to the provincial governments to do.
Because of the 18th Amendment.
And I think an audit should be done to find out how much money has been given to the provincial governments as a result of the NFC award of 2009. Incrementally, how much have they received and what have they done with it? And where are the results? Do we see the results in improved child nutrition, for example? Do we see the results in improved educational indicators? Show us the results. Because that's long enough. From 15 years is long enough to produce results somewhere along the line.
So
that should be done.
This answer that you're giving is an answer that I've heard from a number of people, right? It's fairly, because it's obvious, right? Document, tax, invest in the people. Yes, the capacity building I like for industries, because I don't think they know how to operate efficiently. That makes a lot of sense. What will happen? This is the should. Given the layers, the political layers, the geopolitical layers, the national layers, the power centers, the influence, given what's happening with the whole PTI situation, what do you think will happen?
What will happen is that what has been happening so far will just sort of continue, right? We will not get off this trajectory. And what has been happening is political wrangling among the parties and economic wrangling among the business elites, where textiles, Initially, all of them ganged up on the CNG sector and threw them overboard and managed to gain for themselves a few years. Now textiles has turned on power generation. Next, they will turn on fertilizer. What they are doing is they are managing the growing shortages that are gripping the energy sector, rather than trying to find a way to bust out. And I think what will happen the safest bet is that this intensification will continue, and we'll just have greater and more virulent kind of wrangling taking place, where industrial sectors and industrial groups are accusing each other of hair-raising kinds of wrongdoings in order to try and get their subsidies withdrawn, so the state can continue affording to pay your subsidies. Right?
So that means that the advice you gave on don't be opportunistic, but find the opportunity and follow the opportunity is because you don't see the situation improve because the steps required for it to improve.
No. Let me,
I'm just trying to make sure I clarify.
I'm not saying run away from the country. I'm saying go where the opportunity is. If the country is providing you with the opportunities, take it.
Of course.
Right? But don't be emotional and say, I want to contribute to my country and therefore. Unless if you are of that bent, make sure you are serious about it, because it's not an easy road to walk. But nevertheless, what I mean by go where the opportunity is that you are increasingly growing up in a globalized world. It's been globalizing since the 90s, but the level to which it has now sort of become one world, or at least the world in which you move, has become one world.
But that world requires the internet to work, which it hasn't been for the last 7 days. And in fact, Pakistanis have been kind of shut off of fiber, and they finally made it to the headlines of the paper that you write in, which was today. So in that globalized world, if we don't have internet, how are we going to survive? Because the state has decided to do whatever it's doing in the background to that internet.
Sometimes I feel really glad that I'm not a member of your generation. And this is one of those.
I'll tell you who's the most screwed in this situation. It's guys my age, because we're too old to restart, but we're too young to give up.
But you're not.
Because
you're never too old to restart.
No, so I agree. Look, I subscribe to that theory that yes, you can reinvent and restart at any point in time in your life. But I think that from a cost-benefit perspective, someone in their mid-40s has a lot more at stake when they're thinking about a restart, because their families are of a certain age, their parents are of a certain age, given our community, our culture, and our system, it's harder, right? I'm not saying that it's impossible, it's harder.
Sure.
And so now our generation, which is at this point, is like, all right, I've got another maybe 20 years left of output. Right? If I am a normal, average, working class person, I'm not a businessman that I'll work till forever. I have 20 years of output. You've just told me that the next 5 to 7 years is going to be pretty much the same thing. That throws me into my 50s. And then it's pretty much downhill from there in terms of work, right? The average trajectory, and then I retire because no one's increased the retirement age, and that's it. So it doesn't look great. Now, if I'm in my 20s, you know what? You're right. Okay, the next 5 years, 7 years, political wrangling, this may not improve. Jump ship, go where the opportunity is. If the opportunity is here, stay here, but go where the opportunity is and don't be stuck, because you are light, you may or may not be married, no kids, responsibilities are lower.
Yes, I think to some extent what you are saying is right. But on the other hand, I will just add that, opportunities are always there.
No, I agree. That's true.
And I think somebody like you who's dynamic and very future oriented, and you're always looking out rather than just sort of becoming comfortable and sinking into your comfort zone. Then somebody like you will find opportunities regardless of how bad things get, because there is a lot of ruin in a nation. There's a lot of ruin in the world. It's not as if we're going to go over a cliff and just die. That's not about to happen. But yeah, there will be intensified wrangling and whatnot, and somewhere in there, somebody like you will find opportunities.
So I'll flip it. I'll be my own devil's advocate. Every society has been through what we are going through. It's not like, you know what I mean? I mean, the Europeans have been through it through the medieval ages, the 1400s, 1500s, whatever they called it. Islam and Arabia went through it. The US went through it in the 1800s. So it's not something new. The world has seen this. It's happened before. I think at the end of the day, we just have to do we have to first of all keep seeking opportunity. You can't give up looking for opportunity. Number two is you can't get involved in the water cooler talk. Because there's going to be those people that hang out by the water cooler and they're not the ones seeking opportunity. They're just hanging around and just perpetuating more and more and more of that. Breakaway. That's not the crowd that you want to hang with because they're not getting anywhere. Seek opportunity and just follow it. And you know what? If you can use the home base to your advantage, because by the way, there are tremendous advantages to this home base. Labor here is cheap. English is a language that is a base language that most people understand. And it is the number one language in the world with 1.5 billion people speaking it. And guess what? We speak it. So leverage that opportunity. And I see that if we can leverage certain opportunity, maybe don't be in a sector that's energy dependent. Try to find a sector that is not as energy dependent, right? Don't set up a factory. Go maybe set up a call center. Okay, fine. The chatbots are going to kill the call center, but maybe something similar, right? Something that requires a little bit of intellectual capital, that can be done remotely and pray the internet works. But I see that, look, people are getting too caught up in the water cooler chat, watching the headlines and getting too pulled down, and so when that's happening, most people are not seeking opportunity. And it is opportunity and private opportunity that will probably drive sort of public discourse and change. That's how I view it.
No, I think that's a great point, and I find absolutely no area that I would disagree with over there. I think well stated.
Last question: why don't you come on video and do a podcast? You write so well in this evolving age where the written word is being replaced by the spoken image or the movement of video. Why not transition the way you articulate and communicate thought to what the new medium or the new sort of choice is for the younger generation?
I don't have a good answer to that question.
You've had great answers to all the questions. I can't believe I stumped you.
So I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave that one at that.
On that note, thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me.
I loved the chat. I really, really enjoyed the discussion. You've answered, I think, most of what I had. In fact, more than what I even thought, because this is a topic that I'd been thinking about for quite a while. And I think that hopefully whoever watches this can finally understand that there is no devil in this equation. There is no sort of bhoot, the bhau as they call it, that's the one to blame and let's go. It was just a series of decisions at different points in time with different interests that have brought us here. And I think that it's important that we forget that and be forward-looking and do what's best, because otherwise it's going to be difficult for the next generation.
Got to find a way to bust out.
Absolutely.
Stop the blame game.
It's done. Move on. Thank you, Khurram. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Faizan.
Thank you for tuning into Digitales. Stay tuned for the next episode. Like, subscribe, comment. I love your feedback. Please keep it coming. And I look forward to engaging with you soon. Bye-bye.